Sometimes the darkest hour brings unexpected light into our lives. When all hope seems lost and the world turns against us, grace can arrive in the most unlikely form. Mary Whitlock stumbles into Cooper's saloon, with blood on her dress and 6 hours left to live. She's been falsely accused of murder, and the townspeople are already building her gallows. The sound of hammering echoes through the dusty streets as they prepare her final dance with death. But Silas McCrae, a kind-hearted cattle rancher with silver threading through his dark hair, sees her innocence when no one else will. He looks past the stains and the fear, seeing the truth in her desperate eyes. He offers her the only protection he can give, his name, in marriage. They wed at midnight, while the real killer hides in the shadows, watching and waiting. Can love and faith triumph over lies and hatred? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn of 1887 had painted Dusty Creek in shades of amber and rust, much like the weathered faces of its inhabitants who had learned to endure whatever hardships the frontier chose to deliver. The town sat like a collection of weathered bones against the vast Montana landscape, its main street a ribbon of packed earth that turned to mud with the first hint of rain and dust with the slightest breeze. Cooper's saloon anchored one end of the street, its batwing doors swinging lazily in the evening air, while Doc Henderson's office and the general store formed the practical heart of the community. Silas McCrae had built his life around routine and quiet dignity. At 53, his hands bore the calluses of honest work, and his eyes held the particular sadness that comes from loving deeply and losing completely. 3 years had passed since Sarah's death, and he still caught himself setting 2 plates for dinner, still turned toward her side of the bed in those drowsy moments between sleep and waking. The silver pocket watch she had given him on their wedding day remained his most treasured possession, its steady tick a reminder that time moves forward, whether the heart is ready or not. The Double S Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of the richest grazing land in the territory. Silas had built it from nothing, starting with a handful of cattle and a determination that matched the Montana winters in its stubbornness. Now it employed 12 men year-round and supported half the town through various dealings. His success had earned him respect, but it was his character that had earned him genuine affection from those who knew him well. Sarah McCrae had been the town's schoolteacher before she married Silas, a woman of uncommon intelligence and endless patience who could gentle a spooked horse as easily as she could explain arithmetic to a reluctant child. Her death from what Doc Henderson had called a sudden fever had left a hole in the community that went far beyond Silas's personal grief. The one-room schoolhouse had remained empty since her passing, a constant reminder of loss that the town couldn't quite bring itself to address. Mary Whitlock's arrival in Dusty Creek had been as sudden and jarring as a thunderclap on a clear day. She appeared at the saloon doors just as the sun was painting the western sky in shades of fire, her dark hair escaping from what had once been a neat bun, her traveling dress torn and stained with what everyone immediately recognized as blood. She moved with the careful precision of someone fighting exhaustion, each step deliberate and measured. The saloon fell silent as she entered, conversations dying mid-sentence as every eye turned toward this stranger who carried trouble like a visible weight on her shoulders. Even through the dirt and desperation, her bearing spoke of education and refinement. This was no dance hall girl or frontier drifter, but a woman of substance who had fallen on circumstances beyond her control. "I need sanctuary," she had said, her voice carrying the faint remnants of an Eastern education overlaid with the practical directness that the frontier demanded of its survivors. "They mean to hang me at dawn, and I am innocent of the crime they've laid at my feet." The bartender, a mountain of a man named Cooper who had given the establishment its name, wiped his hands on his apron and studied her with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read trouble before it announced itself. "What crime might that be, miss?" "Murder," she replied without flinching. They say I killed Thomas Brennan 3 days past, but I swear on my mother's grave that I did not." The name Thomas Brennan sent a ripple of recognition through the crowd. The son of Edmund Brennan, one of the territory's most powerful landowners, Thomas had been found dead on his father's property, with evidence pointing toward this very woman. The territorial sheriff had issued a warrant, and half the county was looking for the schoolteacher turned fugitive. Silas had been nursing a whiskey in the corner, seeking the temporary numbness that sometimes eased the constant ache of missing Sarah. But something in Mary Whitlock's voice, some quality of truth beneath the desperation, made him look up from his glass and really see her. Her eyes held intelligence and pain in equal measure, and despite the blood on her dress and the exhaustion in her posture, she faced the hostile crowd with a dignity that spoke of inner strength. "I taught children for 15 years, Mary continued, addressing the room but somehow seeming to speak directly to Silas. "I have held dying animals and comforted grieving families. I have never raised my hand in anger against another human being, and I would not know how to commit the violence they accuse me of." Doc Henderson had entered the saloon during her speech, his medical bag in hand and his weathered face creased with concern. At 68, he had seen enough of life to recognize truth when it stood before him, and something in Mary's manner convinced him that her words carried weight. "Let me examine those injuries, ma'am," he said quietly. "If you're to have any chance of convincing folks of your innocence, we need to understand what happened to you." The crowd watched as Doc Henderson gently examined the cuts on Mary's hands and arms, his practiced eye noting details that others might miss. "These are defensive wounds," he announced after several minutes. "Someone attacked this woman, and she fought back. These injuries are consistent with someone who was trying to protect herself, not someone who was committing murder." Sheriff Coleman had arrived then, his badge catching the lamplight as he pushed through the crowd with the swagger of a man who enjoyed his authority, perhaps a bit too much. He was younger than most men in his position, having inherited the job through political connections rather than experience, and his handling of difficult situations often reflected that inexperience. "Mary Whitlock," he had declared, his hand resting on his gun, "you're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Brennan. You'll be held in the town jail tonight, and we'll hang you at sunrise." "That's rather quick, Justice, even for frontier standards," Silas had said, rising from his corner table with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to command. "Don't you think the woman deserves a proper trial?" Sheriff Coleman's eyes narrowed as he recognized the challenge in Silas's tone. "The evidence is clear, McCrae. Her belongings were found at the scene, and she fled rather than face justice. That's guilt enough for any reasonable person." "Evidence can be planted," Mary said quietly, "and a woman alone on the frontier learns to run first and ask questions later when men with guns come calling in the night." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife as the two men faced each other across the crowded space. Silas McCrae represented old-fashioned justice and careful consideration, while Sheriff Coleman embodied the quick solutions that frontier towns sometimes favored when they were more interested in resolution than truth. "I'll stand surety for her," Silas announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man whose word had never been questioned. "Let her stay the night as my guest, and if she tries to run, I'll answer for it personally." The crowd murmured at this unexpected development. Silas McCrae was known for his fairness and his judgment, but this seemed like an extraordinary risk to take for a complete stranger accused of murder. Mary looked at him with something approaching wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe that someone was willing to stand between her and the noose. "Why?" she asked simply. Silas met her eyes and saw something there that reminded him of Saranot in appearance, for the two women could hardly have been more different, but in the quality of quiet strength that had first drawn him to his late wife. "Because everyone deserves the benefit of doubt until proven otherwise," he replied, "and because I've learned to listen when my instincts tell me something doesn't add up." The sheriff was clearly unhappy with this arrangement, but Silas McCrae's influence in the community made it difficult to override his request without cause. "She's your responsibility then," Coleman said finally. "But come morning, she faces justice whether you like it or not." As the crowd began to disperse, carrying with them the promise of gossip that would fuel conversations for weeks to come, Mary found herself alone with the man who had just saved her life, at least temporarily. The weight of his kindness settled over her like a blanket, welcome but somehow making her more aware of how cold and frightened she had been. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. Silas studied her face in the lamplight, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the determined set of her mouth despite her obvious fear. "Start by telling me the truth," he replied. "All of it. If I'm to help you, I need to understand exactly what we're facing." And so, in the quiet corner of Cooper's saloon, while the night settled over Dusty Creek like a familiar friend, Mary Whitlock began to tell her story to the one man who seemed willing to believe that sometimes the truth is more complicated than it appears on the surface. 3 days earlier, Mary Whitlock had been living a quiet life as the schoolteacher in Cedar Falls, a small settlement 2 days' ride north of Dusty Creek. She had found peace in the routine of teaching children their letters and numbers, in the simple satisfaction of watching young minds discover the world through books and careful instruction. Her modest cabin sat at the edge of town, surrounded by a small garden where she grew vegetables and tended flowers that reminded her of her childhood home back east. The morning that changed everything had started like any other. Mary had risen with the sun, prepared her lessons for the day, and walked the familiar path to the one-room schoolhouse where she had taught for the past 3 years. The autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, and she had paused to appreciate the simple beauty of the morning before beginning another day of shaping young lives. It was during the lunch recess that she noticed the commotion at the Brennan property. The sprawling ranch house sat on a hill overlooking the town, and from the schoolhouse window, Mary could see riders approaching the main house at unusual speed. Something about their urgency troubled her, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Thomas Brennan had been a frequent visitor to Cedar Falls, ostensibly checking on his father's business interests, but increasingly seeming to find excuses to stop by the school. At 28, he was younger than Mary by more than a decade, but he had pursued her with the persistence of a man unaccustomed to being refused. His attention had been unwelcome, but not threatening until recently, when his manner had grown more insistent and his comments more pointed about what he could offer a woman in her position. That afternoon, after dismissing her students for the day, Mary had decided to take her usual walk along the creek that gave the town its name. The path wound through cottonwoods and willows, providing a peaceful retreat where she could think and plan her lessons for the following day. It was her favorite time of day, when the light turned golden and the world seemed to slow its relentless pace. She was returning from her walk when she heard voices raised in anger coming from the grove of trees that bordered the Brennan property. Something in the tone sharp with desperation and threat made her pause and step off the main path, moving carefully through the underbrush toward the sound. What she saw through the trees would haunt her for the rest of her life. Thomas Brennan stood in a small clearing, his face flushed with anger, as he confronted a man Mary recognized as Jake Morrison, one of his father's hired hands. Jake was a lean, dangerous-looking man, with cold eyes and hands that never seemed far from the gun at his hip. Even from her hiding place, Mary could sense the violence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "You can't do this to these people," Thomas was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "I won't let my father destroy their lives for the sake of greed." Jake Morrison's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Your daddy don't much care what you will and won't let happen, boy. The railroad's coming through, and these small farmers are sitting on land that's about to be worth 10 times what they paid for it. Your father aims to own every acre from here to the territorial line. By cheating them out of their property, by foreclosing on mortgages they don't even owe. I've seen the documents, Jake. I know what you've been doing with those forged papers." Mary pressed herself against the trunk of a large cottonwood, her heart pounding as she realized she was witnessing something far more dangerous than a simple business disagreement. The wanted poster that would later bear her name and description was already being prepared in some distant office, though she had no way of knowing it. "You've seen too much for your own good," Jake said, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Your daddy should have kept you in line instead of letting you poke your nose where it don't belong." "My father doesn't know about this conversation," Thomas replied, though Mary could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I came here to give you a chance to stop this madness before innocent people get hurt." "Too late for that, boy. Way too late." The gunshot cracked through the afternoon air like thunder, and Mary watched in horror as Thomas Brennan crumpled to the ground. Jake Morrison stood over him for a moment, smoking pistol in hand, before holstering the weapon with the casual indifference of a man who had killed before. Mary's involuntary gasp of shock carried further than she intended in the sudden silence. Jake's head snapped up, his predator's instincts immediately alert to the possibility of a witness. His eyes scanned the tree line, and Mary pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying that he hadn't spotted her. For several long minutes, she remained frozen against the tree trunk, hardly daring to breathe as Jake Morrison searched the area around the clearing. She could hear him moving through the underbrush, breaking branches and cursing under his breath as he looked for whoever had made that sound. Finally, apparently satisfied that he was alone, Jake began the grim work of staging the scene. Mary watched in growing horror as he arranged Thomas's body and scattered various items around the clearing, items that she realized with sickening clarity were meant to implicate someone else in the murder. Among the scattered belongings, she recognized her own leather satchel, the one that had gone missing from the schoolhouse 2 days earlier. Jake pulled out her handkerchief, monogrammed with her initials, and placed it near Thomas's outstretched hand. He scattered papers from her lesson plans around the clearing, and even produced a hair ribbon that she had lost weeks ago. The methodical way Jake Morrison planted evidence spoke of careful planning and cruel intelligence. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated murder designed to eliminate Thomas Brennan and frame an innocent woman for the deed. The wanted poster would describe her perfectly because Jake had been watching her, studying her habits, and collecting her belongings for exactly this purpose. As Jake finished his work and mounted his horse to ride back toward the main ranch house, Mary realized that her peaceful life as a schoolteacher had just ended forever. She was now a fugitive from a crime she hadn't committed, pursued by men who would never believe her word against the evidence Jake Morrison had so carefully arranged. She waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before emerging from her hiding place. Thomas Brennan lay still in the clearing, his young life cut short by greed and conspiracy. Mary knelt beside him long enough to whisper a prayer for his soul, her teacher's hands gentle, even in this moment of terror, as she closed his sightless eyes. The ride to Dusty Creek had been a nightmare of fear and desperation. Mary had packed only what she could carry, leaving behind 15 years of careful living and the security she had worked so hard to build. Every sound on the trail made her jump. Every rider in the distance sent her heart racing with the fear that Jake Morrison or his associates had found her trail. By the time she reached Cooper's saloon, exhaustion and terror had taken their toll. The blood on her dress came from the defensive wounds she had sustained when Jake Morrison's men had tracked her to her cabin on the second night of her flight. She had fought them off with a kitchen knife and escaped through a back window, but not before suffering cuts that reminded her of how close death had come. Now, sitting across from Silas McCrae in the relative safety of the saloon, Mary finished her account and waited for his response. She had told him everything, the murder she had witnessed, the evidence that had been planted, and the systematic way her life had been destroyed to cover up Thomas Brennan's inconvenient stand against his father's illegal schemes. "Jake Morrison," Silas said thoughtfully, his weathered fingers turning his whiskey glass slowly on the table. "I know that name. He worked for several ranchers in this territory before Edmund Brennan hired him. Men like that don't usually stay in one place long. They follow the work that suits their particular talents." "You believe me?" Mary asked, hardly daring to hope. Silas met her eyes across the table, seeing the truth that others had missed in their rush to judgment. "I believe you witnessed something that powerful men wanted kept secret. I believe they're willing to let you hang rather than risk their plans being exposed. And I believe that unless we can prove your innocence, they'll succeed." The wanted poster with Mary's description was already circulating through the territory, offering a substantial reward for her capture. But sitting in the lamplight of Cooper's saloon, listening to the quiet strength in Silas McCrae's voice, Mary felt the first glimmer of hope she had experienced since that terrible afternoon when a gunshot changed everything. Outside, the sound of hammering echoed through the night as the townspeople prepared the gallows for her execution. But inside the saloon, a cattle rancher and a fugitive schoolteacher began planning how to expose a conspiracy that reached further than either of them yet realized. The walk from Cooper's saloon to Silas McCrae's ranch house passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps on the packed earth and the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Mary kept pace beside him, acutely aware that her life now depended on the kindness of a man she had met only hours before. The weight of that dependence sat heavy on her shoulders, mixing gratitude with the fierce independence that had carried her through 15 years of frontier teaching. Silas's ranch house stood 2 stories tall against the star-filled sky, its windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps. It was a home built for a family, with a wide front porch that spoke of evening conversations and a garden that showed the careful tending of a woman's hand, now growing wild in the 3 years since Sarah's death. Mary could see the echoes of love in every detail, the swing that hung motionless from the porch roof, the flower beds that still bloomed despite their neglect, the rocking chairs positioned to catch the morning sun. "Sarah loved this place," Silas said quietly, noticing Mary's attention to the garden. "She could make anything grow, even in years when the rain forgot to come. Said it was about understanding what each plant needed and giving it room to flourish." Mary heard the grief that still colored his words after 3 years, recognizing the particular sadness of a man who had built his dreams around sharing them with someone else. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was. Silas paused at the front steps, his hand resting on the porch rail that Sarah had insisted he build to her exact specifications. "I need you to understand something before we go inside. What I'm offering you, marriage, for protection, it's not something I take lightly. This house, this name, they carry Sarah's memory, and I won't dishonor that memory for convenience." Mary turned to face him in the lamplight spilling from the windows, seeing the struggle written in the lines around his eyes. Here was a man wrestling with loyalty to the dead and compassion for the living, trying to find a path that honored both. "I would never ask you to dishonor her memory. If there's another way—" "There isn't," Silas said firmly. "Sheriff Coleman means to see you hang, whether you're guilty or not. The Brennan name carries weight in this territory, and Edmund Brennan wants someone to pay for his son's death. Marriage, to me, gives you legal protection and social standing that might buy us time to prove your innocence." Inside the house, the presence of Sarah McCrae lingered in every room like a benevolent spirit. Her books lined the shelves in the parlor, her sewing basket sat beside the fireplace, with a half-finished piece of embroidery still stretched on its frame, and her photograph smiled down from the mantelpiece, a woman with kind eyes and laugh lines who had clearly brought joy to this home. Mary found herself drawn to the bookshelf, running her fingers along spines that revealed a woman of broad interests and deep learning. Shakespeare sat beside practical guides to animal husbandry, poetry collections, neighbored books on frontier medicine, and children's primers showed Sarah's dedication to education. "She taught school?" "For 12 years before we married," Silas confirmed, settling into a chair that had clearly been his for many years. "She always said education was the one thing that could follow a person anywhere, that it couldn't be stolen or lost to bad luck. I think she would have liked you." The observation hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address. Mary settled into the chair across from him, noting how the lamplight softened the harsh lines that worry and grief had carved into his features. Without the tension of the saloon confrontation, she could see the man Sarah had fallen in love with, steady, thoughtful, possessed of a quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself. "Tell me about your teaching," Silas said, clearly wanting to know more about the woman he was proposing to protect. 15 years is a long time to dedicate to other people's children. Mary's face softened as she spoke of her calling. I started when I was barely 18, in a town so small it didn't even have a name. Just the settlement near Miller's Creek. The children there had never seen books before, had never imagined that marks on paper could tell stories or teach them about places beyond their own horizon. Watching them discover reading was like watching people learn they could fly. She told him about the challenges convincing parents that educating girls was as important as educating boys, finding ways to teach children who spoke 3 different languages at home, creating lessons with almost no supplies and even less support from the community. But she also spoke of the rewards, the moment when struggling readers suddenly understood, the pride in parents' faces at school programs, the letters she still received from former students who had gone on to build better lives. "What drew you to Cedar Falls?" Silas asked, genuinely curious about the path that had led her to this moment of crisis. The previous teacher had passed away, and they needed someone quickly. The school board promised me a living wage and my own cabin, which was more stability than I'd had in years. I thought I could build something permanent there, maybe even start a lending library for the community. Mary's voice carried the wistfulness of plans that would never come to fruition. I suppose I should have known better than to believe any place was truly safe for a woman alone. Silas heard the years of careful living in her words, the constant awareness that her security depended on the goodwill of others and could be swept away without warning. It was a vulnerability he had never fully understood during his marriage to Sarah, when the protection of his name and presence had been taken for granted. "Marriage to me would be different," he said carefully. "It would be a partnership of necessity, not—" He struggled to find words that wouldn't insult either of them. "I want you to understand that I'm not looking for someone to replace Sarah. What I'm offering is protection and respect. Nothing more unless—" He stopped himself before venturing into territory that neither of them was ready to explore. Mary studied his face in the lamplight, seeing the honesty there and the careful way he was trying to give her choices, even in circumstances that offered few. "I understand, and I want you to know that I've never been married, never even been seriously courted. I've built my life around independence and self-reliance. The idea of suddenly being someone's wife, even in name only, is—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Overwhelming." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in thought about the enormous step they were contemplating. The house around them seemed to breathe with memories of the love it had sheltered, and Mary wondered if she would always feel like an intruder in Sarah's carefully created home. "There's something else you should know," Silas said finally, reaching into his vest pocket to withdraw the silver pocket watch that had belonged to his wife. "Sarah gave this to me on our wedding day. She said it was to remind me that love makes every moment precious, even the ordinary ones." He opened the watch case, revealing not only the delicate timepiece, but also a small photograph of Sarah and an inscription in her careful handwriting. "To my beloved Silas, our time together be measured not in hours, but in happiness." Mary felt tears prick at her eyes as she understood the significance of what he was showing her. This watch was his most treasured possession, the tangible link to the woman who had been his whole world. That he was sharing it with her spoke to the gravity of their situation and the trust he was placing in her character. "She was fortunate to have a love like that," Mary said softly. "Not many people find someone who values them so completely." "No," Silas agreed, closing the watch gently and returning it to his pocket. "They don't. Which is why I want you to understand that what I'm offering you is born from respect and necessity, not from any attempt to recreate what Sarah and I had. That would be unfair to both of you." Mary nodded, touched by his honesty and the careful way he was trying to protect everyone's dignity in an impossible situation. "I would never presume to take her place. If we do this, if you truly believe marriage is the only way to save my life, then I'll be grateful for your protection and try my best to be worthy of your name without dishonoring your memories." Silas rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out at the land he had built into a prosperous ranch through years of hard work and careful planning. "There's one more thing we need to discuss. My mother's wedding ring." He turned back to face her, his expression serious. "It's been in the McCrae family for 3 generations. If we're to convince people this marriage is legitimate, you'll need to wear it. But I want you to understand what that ring represents, not just to me, but to this family." He moved to a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, withdrawing a simple gold band that gleamed softly in the lamplight. "This ring has seen genuine love, Mary. It deserves to be worn with respect, even if the circumstances aren't what my mother or grandmother would have expected." Mary looked at the ring, understanding the weight of tradition and expectation it carried. Here was a man asking her to take on not just his name, but his family's legacy, to become part of a story that had been generations in the making. The responsibility of that trust was almost overwhelming. "I would be honored to wear it," she said quietly, "and I promise you that I'll treat it and everything it represents with the respect it deserves." Outside, the night wind carried the sound of voices from town, reminders that the gallows awaited her at dawn, unless this desperate plan succeeded. But inside the warmth of Sarah McCrae's parlor, a widow and a fugitive schoolteacher took the first tentative steps toward a partnership that might save them both. Dawn was still hours away when Silas led Mary up the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor of the ranch house. His footsteps deliberately quiet on the wooden steps that Sarah had insisted he build with just the right rise and tread for comfortable climbing. The hallway stretched before them, lined with doors that opened onto rooms that had been planned for the family. Sarah had dreamed of having children who would fill the house with laughter and the comfortable chaos of a life fully lived. "This was going to be the nursery," Silas said softly, pausing before a door that remained firmly closed. Sarah spent months planning how to arrange it, what colors would be best for the light. She said a baby's first room should feel like a gentle welcome to the world. His hand rested briefly on the door handle before moving away. "I haven't opened it since it became clear that our dreams of children wouldn't come to pass." Mary felt the weight of old sorrow in his words, and chose not to intrude with questions or sympathy that might feel inadequate. Instead, she followed him to the end of the hall, where he opened a door to reveal a guest room that had clearly been prepared with care. Clean linens on the bed, fresh water in the wash basin, and even a few wildflowers in a simple vase on the dresser touches that spoke of a man who understood the importance of making someone feel welcome, even in desperate circumstances. "This was Sarah's sewing room," he explained, noting Mary's attention to the details that softened the practical space. She insisted we needed a proper guest room for when her sister came to visit, though Martha only made it out from Denver twice in all our years together. "Sarah always said hospitality was a sacred duty, that you never knew when you might be entertaining angels unaware." Mary moved to the window that looked out over the moonlit pastures, where cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the human drama unfolding in their midst. "Your wife sounds like she was a woman of deep faith." She was. It sustained her through the hard times and made her grateful for the good ones. "I think," Silas paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think she would approve of what we're doing tonight, not because she'd want me to remarry, but because she believed in protecting innocence and standing up for truth." They stood in the soft lamplight for several minutes, 2 people on the threshold of a decision that would change both their lives irrevocably. Mary could feel the ghosts of Sarah's presence in every corner of the room, from the carefully chosen curtains to the quilt that had been stitched with loving hands. Tomorrow, if they went through with this plan, she would be the mistress of this house, responsible for preserving and honoring everything Sarah had built. "I should let you rest," Silas said finally. "We have much to do before dawn, and you'll need your strength for what's coming." But as he turned to leave, Mary found herself speaking the fear that had been growing in her heart since they left the saloon. "What if they don't believe us? What if Sheriff Coleman decides that marriage to you isn't enough protection, that he can still drag me to the gallows regardless of your name?" Silas turned back to face her, seeing the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide beneath her composed exterior. Here was a woman who had faced 15 years of frontier life with courage and determination, but who was now confronting the very real possibility that tomorrow's sunrise might be her last. Then we'll face that together. You won't die alone, Mary. Whatever happens, you have my word on that. The simple promise carried more weight than elaborate vows might have. In a world where a woman's safety often depended on the protection of men who might withdraw that protection on a whim, Silas McCrae was offering something rare: reliability and constancy that didn't depend on her ability to please or appease. After he left her alone in the guest room, Mary sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to truly comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. In a few hours, she would walk down the aisle of Dusty Creek's small church and marry a man she had known for less than a day. She would take his name, accept his protection, and become part of a story that had been decades in the making. The wedding dress hung in the wardrobe where Silas had placed it after retrieving it from storage. Sarah's dress, carefully preserved and now destined for a ceremony Sarah could never have imagined. Mary had protested when he suggested it, feeling like she was intruding on sacred ground, but Silas had insisted with a firmness that brooked no argument. Sarah would want her dress to serve love and protection, he had said. Even if the circumstances aren't what she dreamed of, the purpose is worthy of her memory. Now, looking at the cream-colored silk with its intricate beadwork and careful construction, Mary marveled at the craftsmanship and the love that had gone into its creation. Sarah had clearly been a woman of taste and means, someone who understood the importance of marking life's significant moments with beauty and ceremony. The dress would need alterations to fit Mary's taller, more angular frame, but there was something deeply moving about the idea of wearing a gown that had been chosen with such hope and joy. Sarah McCrae had walked down the aisle in this dress, believing she was beginning a lifetime of shared dreams and mutual support. Tomorrow, Mary would wear it as armor against injustice and false accusation. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, expecting to see Silas returning with some forgotten detail about their preparations. Instead, she found herself facing Mrs. Henderson, Doc Henderson's wife, carrying a sewing basket and wearing the expression of a woman on a mission. Eleanor Henderson was known throughout the territory for her skill with a needle and her ability to alter any garment to fit perfectly, no matter how challenging the proportions. "Silas sent word that you might need some help with the dress," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble, her sharp eyes already assessing Mary's measurements with the practiced gaze of someone who had been fitting clothes for 40 years. "Can't have you getting married in something that doesn't fit proper. People will talk enough as it is, without giving them more ammunition." Mary had met Eleanor Henderson only briefly during the evening's events, but the older woman's presence brought an unexpected comfort. Here was someone who understood the practical necessities of frontier life and the importance of maintaining dignity even in extraordinary circumstances. "I appreciate your help," Mary said, though she felt awkward about accepting such intimate assistance from a virtual stranger. "I'm not sure this is appropriate wearing another woman's wedding dress." Eleanor's expression softened as she lifted the dress from its protective wrapping and held it up to the lamplight. "This dress was made for love, child." Sarah McCrae would be the first to say that love takes many forms, and protecting innocence is one of the highest forms there is. Don't you worry about appropriateness. Worry about staying alive long enough to prove your innocence. The next hour passed in a flurry of careful pinning and stitching as Eleanor worked to adjust the dress to Mary's proportions. The older woman's fingers moved with the sureness of long practice, taking in seams here, letting out fabric there, all while maintaining a steady stream of conversation that revealed both her practical wisdom and her genuine concern for Mary's welfare. "You're not the first woman to face injustice in this territory," Eleanor said around a mouthful of pins. "Frontier law tends to favor men with money and influence, and women who stand in their way often find themselves in impossible situations. But you're fortunate in your choice of protector. Silas McCrae is as honorable a man as you'll find anywhere." As she worked, Eleanor shared stories of other women who had faced difficult circumstances and found ways to survive and even thrive despite the odds stacked against them. Her tales were both cautionary and encouraging, reminding Mary that she was part of a long tradition of women who refused to be broken by circumstances beyond their control. The important thing, Eleanor concluded as she made the final adjustments to the dress's hem, is to remember who you are, regardless of what others say about you. You're an educated woman, a teacher who's dedicated her life to helping others. Don't let fear or desperation make you forget your own worth. When the alterations were complete, Mary stood before the room's small mirror and saw a stranger looking back at her. The dress transformed her from a fugitive schoolteacher into someone who might believably be the bride of a prosperous rancher. The cream silk brought out the warmth in her dark hair, and the careful beadwork caught the lamplight like captured stars. Sarah would be pleased, Eleanor said with satisfaction, gathering her sewing supplies and preparing to leave. You'll do her dress proud, and more importantly, you'll do yourself proud. Marriage to Silas will give you time and protection, but ultimately you'll need to find the strength to fight for your own justice. After Eleanor left, Mary sat alone with her reflection and tried to imagine what tomorrow would bring. In a few hours, she would stand before Preacher Williams and promise to honor and cherish a man she barely knew. The vows would be legal and binding, creating a partnership based on necessity rather than affection, but somehow that made them no less significant. The sound of hammering had finally stopped outside, suggesting that the gallows was complete and ready for its grim purpose. But here in Sarah McCrae's sewing room, wearing Sarah's wedding dress and protected by Silas's determination to see justice done, Mary allowed herself to hope that tomorrow's dawn might bring something other than her death. She folded her travel-stained clothes and placed them carefully in the corner, symbolically setting aside the terrified fugitive she had been and preparing to become Mary McCrae, name that carried weight and respect in this territory. A name that might be strong enough to protect her until the truth could set her free. The church bells of Dusty Creek had never rung at midnight before, but Preacher Williams had agreed that extraordinary circumstances called for extraordinary measures. The small wooden church sat at the quiet end of Main Street, its simple cross silhouetted against the star-filled sky like a beacon of hope in the darkness. Candlelight flickered through the windows, casting dancing shadows on the walls where generations of frontier families had celebrated births, mourned deaths, and marked the significant moments that defined their lives. Silas stood at the altar in his best suit, the one he had worn to marry Sarah 15 years earlier, and had not touched since her funeral. The dark wool still fit well across his broad shoulders, though he had needed Eleanor Henderson's help with the collar that Sarah had always adjusted for him with the practiced ease of long marriage. His hands, normally steady from years of working with horses and cattle, trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie and waited for his bride to arrive. Doc Henderson served as witness and unofficial guardian of the proceedings, his medical bag set aside in favor of his role as community elder and voice of reason. At 70, he had seen enough of life to understand that sometimes survival required unconventional solutions, and he had agreed to stand with Silas and Mary as they attempted to use the law's own provisions to protect innocence from injustice. "Never thought I'd be attending a wedding at this hour," Doc said quietly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the candlelit sanctuary. "But then again, I never thought I'd see a woman about to be hanged for a crime that doesn't sit right in any reasonable person's mind." Eleanor Henderson bustled about the church, making final preparations, her practical nature asserting itself even in these unusual circumstances. She had brought flowers from her own garden, late-blooming roses and chrysanthemums that would normally have graced Sunday morning services, and arranged them at the altar with the same care she brought to everything she touched. "If we're going to do this thing," Eleanor had declared when Silas asked for her help, "we're going to do it properly. That girl has been through enough without having to remember her wedding as a shabby affair conducted in haste and desperation." Preacher Williams adjusted his spectacles and opened his worn Bible to the marriage ceremony, though he had performed the service so many times over the years that he could have recited it from memory. At 65, he had married most of the couples in Dusty Creek and buried many of them as well, but he had never officiated at a wedding designed primarily to save someone's life. "I want you to understand," he had told Silas earlier that evening, "that marriage is a sacred covenant in the eyes of God, regardless of the circumstances that bring people to the altar. If I perform this ceremony, it will be real and binding, not just a legal fiction to frustrate Sheriff Coleman's plans." "I understand," Silas had replied, "and I give you my word that I'll honor the vows I make tonight, whatever form that honor needs to take." The sound of approaching footsteps on the church's wooden floor announced Mary's arrival, and Silas turned to see her walking down the aisle with a dignity that took his breath away. Sarah's wedding dress had been transformed by Eleanor's skillful alterations into something that seemed made specifically for Mary's taller frame and more angular features. The cream silk caught the candlelight and seemed to glow with an inner radiance that made her appear almost ethereal. Doc Henderson had offered to escort her down the aisle, taking on the role that her father might have played under different circumstances. Mary's hand rested lightly on his arm, and Silas could see that she was drawing strength from the older man's steady presence and quiet support. As she reached the altar and took her place beside him, Silas was struck by the incongruity of the moment. Here they were, two people who had known each other for less than 12 hours, standing before God and witnesses to pledge their lives to one another. Yet there was something right about it too, something that felt like destiny rather than desperation. "Dearly beloved," Preacher Williams began, his voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary, "we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly or carelessly, but with reverence and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God." Mary felt the weight of the traditional words, understanding that despite the unusual circumstances, she was participating in one of humanity's most ancient and sacred rituals. The marriage certificate that would result from this ceremony would be more than just legal protection. It would be a promise and a responsibility that would bind her to Silas McCrae in ways she was only beginning to understand. "Silas McCrae," the preacher continued, "do you take Mary Whitlock to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" Silas looked into Mary's eyes as he spoke his response, seeing not just the desperate woman who had stumbled into Cooper's saloon, but the intelligent, courageous person who had dedicated her life to education and service. "I do," he said clearly, his voice carrying conviction that surprised them both. When it came time for Mary to speak her vows, she found herself overwhelmed by the gravity of what was happening. This man was offering her not just his name and protection, but his reputation, his future, and his place in a community that had accepted and respected him for decades. That he would risk all of that for a stranger spoke to a character that demanded her respect and her commitment to be worthy of his sacrifice. "I do," she said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. "I promise to honor the trust you've placed in me and to be worthy of the name you're giving me." The exchange of rings carried particular significance in the candlelit sanctuary. Silas slipped his mother's wedding band onto Mary's finger, the gold warm from his touch and seeming to pulse with the accumulated love of 3 generations of McCrae women. When Mary placed the simple gold band she had borrowed from Eleanor onto Silas's finger, she understood that she was not just accepting his protection, but joining a family tradition that stretched back to Scotland and forward to whatever future they might build together. "By the power vested in me, by the territorial government, and in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit," Preacher Williams pronounced, "I now declare you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and brief, more symbolic than passionate, but it carried the weight of promise and the beginning of a partnership that neither of them fully understood yet. As their lips touched, Mary felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with finding her place in a larger story. The marriage certificate that Doc Henderson and Eleanor signed as witnesses was more than just a piece of paper. It was Mary's shield against the injustice that waited for her with the dawn. As Mrs. Mary McCrae, she would have legal rights and social protection that Mary Whitlock, the fugitive schoolteacher, could never claim. But as they left the church together, walking side by side into the pre-dawn darkness, both Silas and Mary understood that they had crossed a threshold that went far beyond legal convenience. They were partners now, bound together by vows that had been spoken before God, and witnesses committed to facing whatever challenges lay ahead as a united front. The gallows still waited in the town square, its harsh geometry a reminder that Sheriff Coleman's justice would not be easily deterred. But Mary McCrae walked toward her future with her head held high, wearing her new name like armor and drawing strength from the steady presence of the man who had chosen to stand between her and the rope. Behind them, the church bells rang out across the sleeping town, announcing to anyone who cared to listen that justice and mercy had found a way to work together in the darkness before dawn. The sound carried on the night wind, reaching even the ears of those who would rather have seen morning bring a hanging than a wedding, a reminder that sometimes love finds a way to triumph over hatred, even when the odds seem impossible to overcome. The first days of Mary's marriage to Silas McCrae passed in a careful dance of adjustment and discovery. She had insisted on earning her place at the ranch rather than simply accepting charity, and Silas had found tasks that utilized her education and organizational skills without overwhelming her as she recovered from the trauma of her ordeal. The Double S Ranch had accumulated years of paperwork that needed sorting, correspondence that required attention, and business records that could benefit from her teacher's methodical approach. Mary established herself in Sarah's former study, a small room off the main parlor that had served as the late Mrs. McCrae's private retreat. The space contained a writing desk, positioned to catch the morning light, shelves lined with books on everything from poetry to practical ranch management, and a comfortable chair where Sarah had spent countless hours reading and planning. It felt presumptuous to occupy such a personal space, but Silas had insisted that the room should be used rather than preserved as a shrine. Sarah always said this room was meant for someone who loved learning, he had told Mary on her second morning as his wife. She'd be pleased to see it serving that purpose again. The ranch's financial records revealed a picture of careful management and steady prosperity. Silas had built his operation methodically over the years, reinvesting profits into better stock and improved facilities rather than pursuing the rapid expansion that had ruined many of his neighbors. His correspondence with cattle buyers, feed suppliers, and shipping agents showed a man who understood his business thoroughly and commanded respect throughout the territory. But as Mary worked her way through the accumulated paperwork, she began to notice patterns that troubled her. Several documents referenced land deals and railroad surveys that seemed to connect to the conspiracy she had witnessed in Cedar Falls. Names that had appeared in Thomas Brennan's accusations against Jake Morrison surfaced repeatedly in official correspondence, suggesting that the corruption extended far beyond Edmund Brennan's immediate circle. One morning, while organizing a stack of territorial survey maps that Silas had inherited from the previous owner of his land, Mary discovered something that made her blood run cold. Among the official documents was a folder containing preliminary railroad route surveys, land acquisition proposals, and correspondence between territorial officials and railroad representatives. The papers detailed a systematic plan to acquire thousands of acres of prime ranch land through a combination of legitimate purchase and questionable foreclosure proceedings. The scheme was elegant in its corruption. Small ranchers would be approached with offers to buy their land at fair market prices. Those who refused to sell would suddenly find themselves facing legal challenges to their ownership-disputed surveys, questioned land patents, or mysterious debts that appeared in territorial records. When they couldn't afford the legal fees to fight these challenges, Their properties would be seized and sold to the railroad companies at a fraction of their true value. Mary's hands trembled as she read through the correspondence, recognizing the methodical destruction of the frontier communities she had come to love during her years of teaching. This wasn't just about individual greed, it was about reshaping the entire territory to serve the interests of distant investors who saw the land only as a commodity to be exploited. Among the papers, she found a letter that mentioned Cedar Falls specifically. Thomas Brennan had been assigned to oversee the acquisition process for that area, but recent reports suggested he was proving unreliable and might need to be replaced by someone more committed to the project's success. The letter was dated just 2 weeks before Thomas's murder. When Silas returned from his morning rounds of the ranch, Mary was waiting for him in the study, with the document spread across Sarah's desk, like evidence in a court proceeding. Her face was pale but determined, and he could see that she had discovered something that changed everything about their situation. "You need to see this," she said without preamble, gesturing to the papers before her. "The conspiracy I witnessed goes far beyond Edmund Brennan's personal greed. This is about the railroad companies taking control of the entire territory." Silas studied the documents with the careful attention of a man who understood that land ownership was the foundation of everything he had built. As the scope of the scheme became clear, his expression darkened with an anger that Mary had not seen before. This wasn't just about abstract corruption, it was about the systematic destruction of the way of life that he and his neighbors had spent decades building. "Jake Morrison isn't just Edmund Brennan's hired gun," Mary continued, her teacher's instincts organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative. "He's part of a larger operation designed to eliminate anyone who stands in the way of the railroad's expansion plans. Thomas Brennan was killed because he refused to continue participating in the fraud, and I was framed because I witnessed the murder." The implications of Mary's discovery extended far beyond her own legal troubles. If the conspiracy was as extensive as the documents suggested, then every independent rancher in the territory was potentially at risk. The Double S Ranch, with its prime grazing land and strategic location, would certainly be a target for acquisition once the railroad companies had eliminated the smaller operations. "We need to get these documents to someone who can act on them," Silas said, his practical nature asserting itself, even as he struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they were facing. "But who can we trust? If this corruption reaches into the territorial government, then anyone we approach could be part of the conspiracy." Mary had been thinking about the same problem since she first understood what the papers revealed. Doc Henderson mentioned that there's a federal marshal who's been investigating irregularities in territorial land transactions. Someone named Samuel Morrison, who's supposedly incorruptible. If we could get these documents to him. "Morrison?" Silas interrupted, his expression sharpening with suspicion. "Any relation to Jake Morrison?" "I don't know, but Doc Henderson seemed to trust him, and we need someone with authority that extends beyond the territorial system." Mary gathered the most damning documents and began organizing them into a packet that would tell the story clearly and completely. "The question is how to get these to him without alerting the people who are willing to commit murder to keep their secrets safe." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching the ranch house at speed. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Coleman riding up the main drive with 2 deputies, their faces grim with purpose and their hands resting casually on their weapons. Behind them rode a man that Silas recognized as one of Edmund Brennan's associates, someone who had no official authority, but whose presence suggested that this was not a social call. "Hide the documents," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him well in dangerous situations throughout his life. "Whatever they want, it's not about protecting justice." Mary quickly gathered the papers and tucked them into a hidden compartment in Sarah's desk, a secret space that Silas had shown her during her first week at the ranch. The hiding place had been Sarah's way of protecting important documents during the uncertain times when territorial law was more hope than reality. Sheriff Coleman's knock on the front door was loud and insistent, carrying the aggressive authority of someone who expected immediate compliance with his demands. Silas answered the door with Mary beside him, presenting a united front that emphasized her new status as his wife and the protection that came with the McCrae name. "Sheriff," Silas said politely, though his tone carried none of the warmth that genuine hospitality would have provided. "What brings you to my ranch on such a fine morning?" "Official business, McCrae. We need to search your property for evidence related to the Thomas Brennan murder case." Coleman's eyes fixed on Mary with barely concealed hostility. "Your wife may have been clever enough to escape hanging through marriage, but that doesn't mean she's escaped justice entirely." The search that followed was thorough and invasive, with the deputies going through every room of the house, while Coleman questioned Mary about her movements and activities since arriving in Dusty Creek. They found nothing incriminating, but Mary understood that the real purpose of the visit was intimidation rather than evidence gathering. Coleman wanted her to know that marriage to Silas McCrae would not protect her indefinitely. As the sheriff and his men prepared to leave, Mary noticed one of the deputies lingering near Sarah's study, his eyes scanning the room with the attention of someone who knew what he was looking for. When he finally rejoined the others, his expression suggested disappointment rather than the satisfaction of a successful search. After the law enforcement party had ridden away, Silas and Mary retrieved the hidden documents and realized that their time was running out. The corruption they had uncovered reached too high and ran too deep for them to handle alone, but every day they delayed increased the risk that they would become the next victims of the conspiracy's deadly efficiency. "We leave for the territorial capital tomorrow," Silas announced, his decision carrying the finality of a man who had weighed all options and chosen the only course that offered hope. "Marshal Morrison may be our only chance to see justice done, and these documents are the only evidence that can prove your innocence and expose the truth about Thomas Brennan's murder." Mary nodded, understanding that they were about to embark on a journey that would either vindicate her completely or result in both their deaths. But as she looked at the man who had risked everything to protect her, she felt a strength that had nothing to do with her own capabilities and everything to do with the power of two people standing together against injustice. The land deed documents had revealed the scope of the conspiracy, but they had also shown Mary and Silas exactly what they were fighting, for not just her freedom, but the preservation of a way of life that valued honesty, hard work, and the rights of ordinary people to build their dreams on solid ground. The discovery came by accident, as the most life-changing revelations often do. Mary had been cleaning Sarah's personal effects from the bedroom closet, a task that Silas had been unable to face in the 3 years since his wife's death. The work was emotionally draining for both of them, handling the intimate belongings of a woman who had been deeply loved, deciding what to preserve and what to finally let go. Each dress, each book, each small personal treasure carried memories that Silas shared reluctantly but with touching devotion. It was while moving Sarah's jewelry box that Mary noticed something unusual. The wooden box, beautifully crafted from cherry wood, with Sarah's initials carved into the lid, seemed heavier than its contents should have warranted. When Mary examined it more closely, she discovered that the bottom had a false panel, skillfully concealed, but slightly warped with age. "Silas," she called softly, her voice carrying a note that made him look up from the photograph album he had been reviewing. "I think Sarah kept secrets too." The hidden compartment contained a single letter, written in Sarah's careful handwriting and addressed simply to "my beloved husband." The paper was of good quality, the kind used for important correspondence, and the date at the top made Mary's heart stop. The letter was dated just 2 days before Sarah's death, 3 years earlier. Silas took the letter with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing immediately the significance of its timing. Sarah had been ill for less than a week when she died, and according to everyone who had attended her, she had been too weak in her final days to write anything beyond her name. Yet here was a letter in her clear, strong handwriting, composed when she should have been too sick to hold a pen. "My dearest Silas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my suspicions about my illness have proven correct, and I am beyond the reach of those who would silence me. I pray that I am wrong, that this letter will remain hidden and unneeded, but I fear that my recent discoveries have made me a danger to powerful men who value profit over human life." Mary watched Silas's face as he read, seeing the confusion and growing horror as Sarah's words revealed a truth that no one had suspected. The gentle schoolteacher who had died of a sudden fever had actually uncovered the same conspiracy that would later claim Thomas Brennan's life. The letter continued with devastating clarity. "I have been investigating the strange pattern of land foreclosures that have affected several of our neighbors. What began as curiosity about legal proceedings has revealed a systematic fraud involving forged documents, bribed officials, and threats against anyone who questions the irregularities. The railroad companies are not simply buying land, they are stealing it through manipulation of territorial laws and corruption of the justice system." Sarah had been more than just a schoolteacher and rancher's wife. Her letter revealed that she had been conducting a careful investigation into the land fraud scheme, using her education and connections to gather evidence that painted a clear picture of the conspiracy. She had contacted territorial officials, interviewed affected ranchers, and even traveled to the capital to examine public records that documented the pattern of illegal acquisitions. "I have hidden copies of all the evidence I have gathered," the letter continued. "The documents are in the place where we kept our most precious dreams, where you will find them only if something happens to me. Edmund Brennan and his associates cannot be allowed to continue their theft of honest people's livelihoods. The evidence I have collected will prove their guilt to any honest court." Silas looked up from the letter, his eyes bright with unshed tears, as he understood the implications of what Sarah had written. "She didn't die of fever," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They killed her because she discovered what they were doing." Mary felt her own eyes fill with tears as she realized that Sarah McCrae had been fighting the same battle that had now consumed her own life. The gentle woman whose dress she wore, whose home she now shared, whose husband she had married, for protection that woman had died, because she had tried to expose the truth about the conspiracy that Mary had witnessed in action. "Jake Morrison," Silas continued, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with horrible clarity. "He killed Sarah just like he killed Thomas Brennan. She was getting too close to the truth, so they eliminated her and made it look like a natural death." The letter's final paragraphs revealed the location of Sarah's hidden evidence documents that would corroborate everything Mary had discovered and provide the proof needed to expose the conspiracy's true scope. Sarah had concealed the papers in the unused nursery, in a hiding place that only Silas would understand, behind the loose floorboard where they had planned to hide Christmas presents for the children they had hoped to have. "She was protecting us even after death," Mary said softly, understanding now why Sarah's presence seemed to linger so strongly in the house. The woman had literally given her life to gather evidence that could bring justice to the territory, and her sacrifice was only now being recognized. The nursery door, which had remained closed since Sarah's death, opened with a protest of hinges that had not moved in 3 years. The room beyond was exactly as Sarah had left it, walls painted in soft yellow that would have welcomed either a son or daughter, a rocking chair positioned near the window where she could have watched over a sleeping child, and careful measurements marked on the wall where Sarah had planned the placement of a crib. The loose floorboard was exactly where Sarah's letter had indicated, hidden beneath what would have been the baby's changing area. Silas pried it up with reverent care, and together they discovered an oilskin packet that contained 3 years' worth of careful investigation into the conspiracy that was destroying frontier communities throughout the territory. Sarah's evidence was even more comprehensive than the documents Mary had found in the ranch's business papers. She had collected testimony from displaced ranchers, copies of forged legal documents, correspondence between corrupt officials, and even detailed maps showing the pattern of illegal land acquisitions. Most damning of all, she had managed to document payments from railroad companies to territorial officials, proving that the corruption reached into the highest levels of government. "My God," Silas breathed as he reviewed the evidence his wife had died to collect. She knew everything. She had enough proof to bring down the entire conspiracy. But Sarah's investigation had revealed something else, something that connected Mary's case to a larger pattern of violence. Among the documents was a list of people who had been eliminated for opposing the land fraud scheme. Thomas Brennan's name was on that list, along with several ranchers who had supposedly died in accidents or from sudden illnesses. Sarah McCrae's own name appeared at the bottom, with a notation that her removal had been accomplished through medical intervention. "They've been murdering people for 3 years," Mary said, her voice hollow with the weight of understanding. "Anyone who got too close to the truth, anyone who threatened to expose them, they were all killed and their deaths made to look natural." The hidden letter had transformed Mary's understanding of everything that had happened. She was not the first person to witness the conspiracy's violence, and she would not be the last unless the evidence Sarah had died to collect could finally bring justice to those responsible. But the letter also revealed that the danger was far greater than either she or Silas had realized. If the conspirators had been willing to kill Sarah McCrae, a beloved teacher and respected member of the community, then they would certainly not hesitate to eliminate Mary and Silas if they discovered what evidence the couple now possessed. "We can't go to the territorial authorities," Silas said, his practical nature cutting through the emotional impact of Sarah's revelations. "If Sarah's investigation was correct, then most of them are part of the conspiracy. We need to find someone with federal authority, someone who can't be bought or intimidated by the railroad companies." Mary nodded, understanding that they were now carrying the weight of Sarah's sacrifice as well as the responsibility for their own survival. The hidden letter had given them the evidence they needed to prove the conspiracy's existence, but it had also revealed just how deadly their enemies were and how far they were willing to go to protect their illegal profits. As they carefully repacked Sarah's evidence and sealed it back in its protective wrapping, both Mary and Silas understood that they were now guardians of a truth that had already cost too many lives. The conspiracy that had begun with land fraud had escalated to systematic murder, and they were the only people left who could expose the truth and bring justice to those who had died trying to protect their communities. The marriage that had begun as protection for a fugitive schoolteacher had become something far more significant, a partnership between two people who shared not just legal bonds, but a sacred mission to honor the memory of a woman who had given her life for justice. Sarah's hidden letter had revealed that love could take many forms, including the courage to stand against evil, even when the cost was ultimate sacrifice. Outside the nursery window, the sun was setting over the land that Sarah had died trying to protect, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise that her sacrifice would not be forgotten. In the room where she had planned to raise children who would carry her values into the future, her evidence waited to finally bring justice to a territory that had been too long under the shadow of corruption and violence. The dawn that had once promised Mary's execution now brought the urgency of a different kind of countdown. Word had reached them through Doc Henderson's careful network of contacts that Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison would be arriving in Dusty Creek within 48 hours, conducting his investigation into territorial land fraud. This was their chance, perhaps their only chance, to present Sarah's evidence and Mary's testimony to someone with the authority and integrity to act on the truth. But Sheriff Coleman's badge had become a symbol of the corrupt authority they were fighting against, and his increasing desperation made him more dangerous with each passing hour. The sheriff had been making inquiries around town, asking pointed questions about Mary's activities and Silas's business dealings, clearly searching for any excuse to arrest them both before the federal marshal could arrive. "He knows we're onto something," Doc Henderson warned during a clandestine meeting at his office where Mary had come seeking treatment for the lingering effects of her injuries from Jake Morrison's attack. "Coleman's been asking everyone in town about your movements, your visitors, even what books you've been reading. A man doesn't show that kind of interest unless he's afraid of what you might know." Eleanor Henderson had joined them for the meeting, her practical wisdom proving invaluable as they planned their strategy for presenting the evidence to Marshal Morrison. She had lived through enough frontier politics to understand that even federal officials could be influenced by local pressures if the right kind of pressure was applied in the right way. The marshal will need to see the evidence properly presented, Eleanor advised, her seamstress's attention to detail extending to matters of justice as well as clothing. Documents organized chronologically, testimony written out clearly, and witnesses prepared to speak truthfully about what they've observed. You can't just dump a pile of papers on his desk and expect him to sort through years of conspiracy. Mary had spent the previous day organizing Sarah's evidence into a comprehensive case file, using her teacher's skills to create a narrative that would guide Marshal Morrison through the complex web of corruption and murder. The task had been emotionally draining, as each document represented another life destroyed or another community betrayed by the conspiracy's greed. The evidence painted a picture of systematic corruption that extended far beyond Edmund Brennan's individual actions. Railroad companies had been working with territorial officials to identify valuable land. Corrupt judges had been ruling in favor of questionable foreclosure proceedings, and hired killers like Jake Morrison had been eliminating anyone who posed a threat to the scheme's success. Sarah documented at least 12 suspicious deaths over the past 3 years. Mary reported as she reviewed the organized evidence with Silas and the Hendersons. Ranchers who refused to sell, officials who asked inconvenient questions, and even a territorial judge who started investigating irregular foreclosure proceedings. They've been methodically removing anyone who stood in their way. Silas studied the list of victims, recognizing names of men he had known and respected neighbors who had supposedly died in accidents or from sudden illnesses that now appeared far more sinister in light of Sarah's investigation. The revelation that his wife's death was part of this pattern of violence had transformed his grief into a determination for justice that burned with steady intensity. "We need more than just documents," he said, his rancher's practical nature focusing on the weaknesses in their case. Marshal Morrison will want living witnesses who can testify to what they've seen and experienced. People who were threatened, people who lost their land under suspicious circumstances, people who can put faces and names to the suffering this conspiracy has caused. Doc Henderson nodded thoughtfully, already considering which of his patients and neighbors might be willing to speak publicly about their experiences. There's Martha Colson, whose husband died right after he started asking questions about irregularities in their mortgage payments. And Jim Bradley, who lost his ranch to foreclosure even though he had documentation proving his payments were current. They might be willing to testify if they knew it could prevent others from suffering the same fate. But gathering witnesses meant revealing their intentions to more people, and every person who knew about their plans represented another potential security risk. The conspiracy had demonstrated its willingness to kill to protect its secrets, and Mary and Silas understood that their own lives hung in the balance as they worked to expose the truth. "Jake Morrison is still out there," Mary reminded them, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen the man's casual brutality firsthand. "He killed Thomas Brennan without hesitation, and he probably killed Sarah just as coldly. If he realizes that we have evidence that could destroy the entire conspiracy, he'll come for us before Marshal Morrison ever arrives." The threat of immediate violence was balanced against the promise of ultimate justice, creating a tension that filled every moment of their preparation. They were racing against time, working to build an unassailable case while trying to stay alive long enough to present it to someone who could act on the evidence. Preacher Williams had agreed to help by providing sanctuary in the church for any witnesses who feared retaliation for their testimony. The old preacher's moral awakening to the corruption in his community had transformed him from a passive observer to an active participant in the fight for justice, and his willingness to risk his own safety gave others the courage to step forward. "The church has always been a place of sanctuary," he declared when Silas approached him about protecting potential witnesses. "If people are willing to speak truth in the face of danger, then the church has a duty to protect them while they do it." The final piece of their preparation involved ensuring that the evidence would survive, even if they did not. Sarah's investigation had taken 3 years to complete, and the proof she had died to gather was too valuable to risk losing to a single act of violence. Copies of the most important documents were hidden in multiple locations, and detailed instructions were left with Doc Henderson about how to contact federal authorities if anything happened to Mary and Silas. "Promise me," Mary said to Eleanor Henderson as they completed the final preparations, "that if we don't survive this, you'll make sure Marshal Morrison sees what Sarah discovered. Too many people have died for this truth to be buried with us." Eleanor's expression was fierce with determination as she made the promise that Mary needed to hear. "That evidence will reach the right hands, child, even if I have to ride to the territorial capital myself and put it directly into the Marshal's possession. Your sacrifice and Sarah's won't be for nothing." The evening before Marshal Morrison's expected arrival brought an unexpected visitor to the ranch. Mary was in Sarah's study, making final revisions to her written testimony, when Silas called her to the front door with unusual urgency in his voice. Standing on their porch was Martha Colson, the widow whose husband had died under suspicious circumstances after questioning his mortgage payments. Martha was a small woman in her 60s, weathered by years of frontier hardship, but possessed of the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive the loss of both her husband and her ranch. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who had endured great suffering but refused to be broken by it. "I heard tell that you folks are planning to speak truth to the federal marshal about what's been happening in our territory," Martha said without preamble, her voice carrying the straightforward honesty that characterized frontier women who had learned to waste neither time nor words. "I've come to offer my testimony about how they murdered my husband and stole our land." Martha's willingness to step forward, despite the obvious danger, represented a turning point in their fight against the conspiracy. Here was a woman who had already lost everything, who could have chosen to remain silent and safe, but who instead chose to risk her life to prevent others from suffering the same fate. "They made it look like a heart attack," Martha continued, settling into the chair that Silas offered her and accepting the cup of coffee that Mary prepared. "But Henry was strong as an ox, never had a sick day in his life until the day he died. The only thing that changed was his decision to hire a lawyer to investigate why our mortgage payments weren't being credited properly to our account." Her testimony added a human dimension to the documentary evidence that Sarah had collected, providing the personal stories that would help Marshal Morrison understand the real cost of the conspiracy's actions. As Martha spoke about finding her husband dead in their barn just hours after meeting with the lawyer, about discovering that their ranch had been sold to railroad representatives before Henry was even buried, Mary felt the weight of all the lives that had been destroyed by the conspirators' greed. The sound of approaching horses interrupted Martha's testimony, and all three of them moved to the window to see who was arriving at the ranch so late in the evening. A single rider was approaching slowly, his posture suggesting exhaustion rather than threat. But Mary's experiences had taught her to view any unexpected visitor with suspicion. The rider proved to be a young man Mary recognized as Tommy Wilson, one of the ranch hands from a neighboring spread. His face was pale with fear and exhaustion as he dismounted and approached the house with obvious reluctance. "Mr. McCrae," Tommy called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. "I've got word from town that you need to hear. Sheriff Coleman's planning something for tomorrow, something involving your wife and the federal marshal. My boss sent me to warn you that it might not be safe to stay here tonight." The warning confirmed their worst fears about Sheriff Coleman's intentions. Rather than allowing Marshal Morrison to conduct an impartial investigation, the corrupt sheriff was planning to take action that would eliminate the threat that Mary and Silas represented to the conspiracy. The badge that symbolized law and order had become a tool for protecting criminals and silencing witnesses. As they prepared for what might be their final night at the ranch, Mary and Silas understood that they had moved beyond the relative safety of legal protection into a realm where survival would depend on their ability to outmaneuver enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. The evidence they carried represented not just their hope for justice, but the accumulated testimony of everyone who had died trying to expose the truth. The climax they had been building toward was no longer a distant possibility, but an immediate reality that would be upon them with the sunrise. Sheriff Coleman's corrupt authority was about to collide with their determination to see justice done, and the outcome would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone in the territory who valued truth over profit and justice over convenience. Dawn broke grey and threatening over Dusty Creek, with heavy clouds rolling in from the west that seemed to mirror the tension building in the small frontier town. Federal Marshal Samuel Morrison had arrived on the evening stage, a tall man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. His reputation for incorruptible integrity had preceded him, and his very presence had sent ripples of unease through the community's power structure. Mary stood at the window of their hotel room, watching the activity in the street below as the town prepared for what everyone sensed would be a day of reckoning. Sheriff Coleman's men were positioned at strategic points throughout the main street, their casual postures failing to disguise the careful way they watched everyone who moved through the area. The gallows that had been built for her execution still stood in the town square, a grim reminder of how quickly frontier justice could turn deadly. "He's here," Silas said quietly, nodding toward a figure emerging from the territorial offices across the street. Federal Marshal Morrison carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command, his dark coat and silver badge marking him as a representative of law that extended beyond territorial politics and local corruption. The marshal had agreed to hear their evidence in the community church, a location chosen for its symbolic significance and its practical advantages. Preacher Williams had opened the sanctuary to serve as a neutral ground where witnesses could speak freely without fear of immediate retaliation, and the church's position at the end of Main Street provided clear sightlines that would make it difficult for anyone to approach without being seen. Mary carried Sarah's evidence in a leather satchel that had belonged to Silas's late wife, the weight of the documents a constant reminder of the sacrifice that had made this moment possible. 3 years of careful investigation, documented corruption, and testimony from the dead would finally have their day in court, though the court would be a frontier church rather than a formal courthouse. The poison vial that Doc Henderson had discovered, hidden in Jake Morrison's belongings, provided the physical evidence that connected Sarah's murder to the larger conspiracy. The small glass container, no bigger than a medicine bottle, contained traces of a substance that Doc Henderson recognized from his medical training, a poison that could mimic the symptoms of fever and leave little trace in a victim's body after death. "Found it sewn into the lining of Morrison's saddlebags," Doc Henderson had explained when he presented the vial to Mary and Silas. "Man was careless enough to keep a souvenir of his crime. Probably figured nobody would ever think to look for evidence of murder when Sarah's death seemed so natural." The discovery of the poison had been the final piece of evidence needed to prove that Sarah McCrae's death was murder rather than illness. Combined with her hidden investigation and the pattern of suspicious deaths throughout the territory, the vial provided irrefutable proof that the conspiracy had been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened their illegal activities. As they walked toward the church through the morning crowds, Mary noticed the way people watched them with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Word had spread through the community that the federal marshal was here to investigate serious charges, and everyone understood that the outcome of the day's proceedings would determine the future of law and order in their territory. Martha Coulson walked beside them, her presence a testament to the courage of ordinary people who refused to be intimidated by threats and violence. The elderly widow had insisted on testifying despite the obvious dangers, declaring that her husband's memory deserved no less than complete honesty about the circumstances of his death. Henry always said that the truth has a way of coming out eventually. Martha had told them the night before. He'd be proud to know that his death is finally going to serve justice instead of just enriching the people who killed him. The church was already filling with townspeople when they arrived, creating an atmosphere that was part legal proceeding and part community meeting. Federal Marshal Morrison had positioned himself at the altar, his commanding presence transforming the sacred space into a courtroom where frontier justice would finally have the chance to operate according to law rather than corruption. Sheriff Coleman entered the church with his deputies, their obvious reluctance to participate in proceedings they couldn't control, written clearly on their faces. The corrupt sheriff's badge caught the morning light streaming through the church windows, a symbol of authority that had been perverted to serve criminal interests rather than justice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marshal Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary, "I'm here to investigate serious allegations of corruption, fraud, and murder that have been brought to my attention. This is not a trial, but it is an official federal investigation, and anyone who interferes with these proceedings will answer to the full authority of the United States government." Mary felt her heart racing as she prepared to present Sarah's evidence and her own testimony about witnessing Thomas Brennan's murder. Everything they had worked for, everything Sarah had died to accomplish, would be decided in the next few hours based on their ability to convince Marshal Morrison that the conspiracy was real and deadly. "Marshal Morrison," Silas said, rising from his seat with the dignity that had made him a respected leader in the community, "my wife has evidence that will prove a systematic pattern of corruption involving land fraud, document forgery, and the murder of anyone who attempted to expose these crimes." The marshal's attention focused on Mary with the intensity of someone accustomed to separating truth from lies through careful observation and questioning. "Mrs. McCrae, I understand you have both documentary evidence and personal testimony regarding these allegations. Please present your case." Mary stood slowly, acutely aware that this moment represented the culmination of everything that had happened since that terrible afternoon when she witnessed Thomas Brennan's murder. The blood-stained dress she had worn into Cooper's saloon had been replaced by the dignity of her position as Silas McCrae's wife, but the truth she carried remained unchanged. "3 days ago, I witnessed the murder of Thomas Brennan by Jake Morrison," she began, her teacher's training helping her organize her thoughts despite the enormous pressure of the moment. "Thomas was killed because he refused to continue participating in a conspiracy to defraud ranchers throughout this territory of their land. I was framed for his murder because I witnessed the crime and could identify the real killer." She presented Sarah's documents methodically, explaining how the late Mrs. McCrae had spent 3 years investigating the pattern of illegal land acquisitions and suspicious deaths that had plagued the territory. Each piece of evidence built upon the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of corruption that reached from local sheriffs to territorial officials to distant railroad boardrooms. "My late wife died because she discovered the truth about this conspiracy," Silas added, his voice heavy with emotion, but steady with determination. "Sarah McCrae was murdered by the same man who killed Thomas Brennan, using poison to make her death appear natural, while silencing the most dangerous threat to their criminal enterprise." Doc Henderson stepped forward to present the poison vial and explain its significance, his medical expertise lending credibility to their claims about how Sarah's death had been engineered to look like illness. The small glass container seemed insignificant in his weathered hands, but its contents represented proof of a crime that had gone undetected for 3 years. "This poison produces symptoms that mimic fever and weakness," Doc Henderson explained to Marshal Morrison. "A woman already weakened by what appeared to be illness would succumb quickly, and unless someone knew to look for traces of the substance, the death would be attributed to natural causes." The marshal examined the vial carefully, his expression giving no indication of his thoughts as he absorbed the implications of what they were telling him. Around the church, the assembled townspeople watched in tense silence as the case that would determine their future was presented with methodical precision. Martha Colson's testimony added the human dimension that transformed abstract evidence into personal tragedy. Her account of her husband's sudden death, immediately after he began investigating irregularities in their mortgage payments, provided a clear example of how the conspiracy eliminated threats through violence disguised as natural causes. "They didn't just steal our land," Martha concluded, her voice strong despite her obvious emotion. "They murdered my husband and made me watch helplessly as everything we'd built together was sold to the very people who killed him. If this marshal can't bring justice for Henry and all the others, then there's no law left in this territory worth respecting." As the morning progressed and more witnesses came forward to testify about their experiences with the land fraud scheme, the scope of the conspiracy became undeniably clear. Ranchers who had lost their property to questionable foreclosures, officials who had been pressured to ignore irregularities, and family members of suspicious death victims all contributed pieces to a puzzle that revealed systematic corruption on a scale that shocked even Marshal Morrison's experienced perspective. But even as the evidence mounted and the case for prosecution became overwhelming, Mary noticed that Sheriff Coleman and his men were becoming increasingly agitated. The corrupt sheriff's authority was being systematically dismantled by federal law, and his desperate expressions suggested that he might be planning some final action to prevent the truth from destroying everything the conspiracy had built. The moment of truth arrived when Jake Morrison himself burst through the church doors, his face twisted with desperation and his hand already reaching for the gun at his hip. The hired killer's appearance sent a ripple of fear through the assembled crowd, but it also provided Marshal Morrison with the opportunity to confront one of the conspiracy's key figures face to face. "Nobody move," Morrison snarled, his weapon drawn and pointed toward the altar where Marshal Morrison stood with calm authority. "This whole proceeding is illegal, and I'm here to arrest the real criminal, starting with that lying woman who killed Thomas Brennan." But Jake Morrison's dramatic entrance had been anticipated by Marshal Morrison, whose years of federal law enforcement had taught him to prepare for exactly this kind of desperate interruption. Two federal deputies emerged from concealment behind the church's side entrances, their own weapons trained on the gunman who thought he could intimidate an official investigation through violence. "Jake Morrison," Marshal Morrison said with the steady confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous confrontations, "you're under arrest for the murders of Thomas Brennan, Sarah McCrae, and conspiracy to commit fraud against the territorial government of Montana. Drop your weapon and surrender yourself to federal custody." The killer's eyes darted around the church, calculating his chances of escape against the federal firepower arrayed against him. In that moment of hesitation, Mary saw the same cold calculation that had characterized his murder of Thomas Brennanthi, mentality of a man who viewed human life as an obstacle to be removed, rather than something possessing inherent value. "You can't prove nothing," Morrison said, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "That woman's a liar and a murderer, and all this evidence is just made-up stories designed to protect her from justice." Marshal Morrison nodded to one of his deputies, who produced a document that would prove to be Jake Morrison's undoing. Thomas Brennan's true will had been discovered in the safe of a lawyer in the territorial capital, a document that revealed the young man's intention to expose his father's illegal activities and make restitution to the victims of the land fraud scheme. Thomas Brennan left detailed testimony about the conspiracy he was forced to participate in. Marshal Morrison announced, reading from the will that Jake Morrison had never known existed. He documented specific instances of fraud, identified key participants in the scheme, and named you, Jake Morrison, as the enforcer who threatened and murdered anyone who opposed the operation. The will's contents sent shockwaves through the church as the assembled crowd learned that Thomas Brennan had not been a willing participant in his father's crimes, but rather a reluctant victim who had been planning to expose the entire conspiracy. His murder by Jake Morrison had been motivated not just by his refusal to continue participating, but by his active threat to reveal everything he knew about the illegal land acquisitions. "Thomas was going to testify against all of you," Mary added, her voice strong with the conviction of someone who had finally seen justice within reach. "That's why Jake Morrison killed him, not because of some personal dispute, but because Thomas was going to bring down the entire conspiracy." Edmund Brennan's arrest followed swiftly, as federal deputies moved through the church to apprehend the land baron whose greed had initiated the cascade of violence and corruption. The elder Brennan's dignified facade crumbled as he realized that his son's death had ultimately resulted in exactly the exposure he had killed to prevent. "You don't understand the economic necessities involved," Brennan protested as federal deputies placed him in custody. "The railroad development of this territory requires decisive action and efficient land acquisition. We were serving progress, not personal profit." But Brennan's attempts to justify his actions rang hollow in a church filled with people who had lost family members, homes, and livelihoods to his economic necessities. The land fraud scheme that he described as progress had destroyed communities and murdered innocent people, leaving behind nothing but enriched conspirators and devastated families. Sheriff Coleman's removal from office came as the final piece of the conspiracy's collapse. The corrupt sheriff's badge was taken from him by Marshal Morrison personally, a symbolic stripping of authority that had been perverted to serve criminal interests rather than justice. "Sheriff Coleman," Marshal Morrison announced, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption of office, and accessory to murder. Your badge and authority are hereby revoked pending federal prosecution for your crimes against the people of this territory." The church erupted in spontaneous applause as the corrupt officials were led away in federal custody, their removal representing not just justice for past crimes, but hope for a future where law enforcement would serve the people rather than the powerful. Mary felt tears streaming down her face as she realized that Sarah's sacrifice had finally resulted in the justice she had died trying to achieve. Doc Henderson stepped forward to accept temporary appointment as sheriff. His lifetime of service to the community and his role in exposing the conspiracy, making him the natural choice to restore honest law enforcement to Dusty Creek. The transfer of the sheriff's badge from corrupt hands to honorable ones symbolized the transformation that was taking place throughout the territory. "I accept this responsibility with the understanding that law enforcement serves justice, not profit," Doc Henderson declared as he pinned the badge to his vest. "This office will be used to protect the innocent and prosecute the guilty, regardless of their wealth or political connections." Mary's vindication was complete when Marshal Morrison formally dismissed all charges against her and issued an official statement clearing her name of any involvement in Thomas Brennan's murder. The wanted poster that had made her a fugitive was publicly destroyed, its false accusations consumed by flames that seemed to purify the air of lies and corruption. "Mrs. Mary McCrae," Marshal Morrison announced to the assembled crowd, "is hereby cleared of all charges related to the death of Thomas Brennan. The evidence presented today proves conclusively that she is innocent of any wrongdoing and was, in fact, a victim of a conspiracy designed to silence witnesses to murder." The town's apology came in the form of unanimous support for Mary and Silas, as the same people who had been prepared to watch her hang now rallied around the couple who had risked everything to expose the truth. The transformation in community sentiment was complete and genuine, born from shame at how quickly they had accepted false accusations and gratitude for the courage Mary and Silas had shown in fighting for justice. Eleanor Henderson spoke for many when she approached Mary after the official proceedings concluded. "We failed you when you needed us most," she said simply, "but we won't make that mistake again. You and Silas have earned the respect and protection of this community for as long as you choose to remain among us." As the crowd began to disperse and the arrested conspirators were transported to the territorial capital for prosecution, Mary and Silas found themselves alone in the church where their marriage had begun as a desperate measure for survival. The sanctuary that had witnessed their midnight wedding now bore testimony to the justice that had vindicated their faith in truth and each other. "Sarah would be proud," Silas said quietly, his voice carrying the peace of someone who had finally seen his wife's murder avenged and her memory honored. "She spent 3 years fighting this conspiracy, and her sacrifice has finally brought the justice she died trying to achieve." Mary nodded, understanding that their marriage had been transformed by the events of this day from a union of necessity into a partnership of choice. They had faced the worst that corruption and violence could offer, and they had emerged not just victorious, but bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. The poison vial, the land deeds, the hidden letters, and all the other artifacts of conspiracy and corruption would be preserved as evidence in the federal prosecution that would follow. But the most important artifact of all was the marriage certificate that had protected Mary's life and enabled the truth to finally triumph over the lies that had cost so many innocent people their lives and livelihoods. 6 months after the trials that had sent Jake Morrison to the territorial prison and Edmund Brennan to federal custody, Mary McCrae stood in the doorway of the Dusty Creek schoolhouse, watching her students practice their letters with the same patient dedication she had brought to teaching for over 15 years. The one-room building had been empty since Sarah's death, but the community had eagerly embraced Mary's offer to resume the educational mission that had been so important to her predecessor. The morning light streamed through windows that Mary had personally cleaned and fitted with new glass, illuminating a classroom that buzzed with the energy of children discovering the power of reading and writing. Her students ranged from 6-year-old Emma Henderson, Doc and Eleanor's granddaughter, to 16-year-old Robert Colson, Martha's nephew who had come to live with his aunt after his own parents decided the territory was too dangerous for raising children. "Mrs. McCrae," called young Emma, her hand raised with the enthusiasm that made teaching such a rewarding profession, "could you help me with this word? I can sound out the letters, but I don't understand what it means." Mary moved to Emma's desk and looked at the word that had stumped the eager student. "Legacy," she read aloud, noting how appropriate it was that this particular word had appeared in Emma's reading primer. It means something valuable that one person leaves behind for others to inherit and treasure. As she helped Emma understand the concept of legacy, Mary reflected on how much her own understanding of that word had deepened over the past months. Sarah McCrae's legacy lived on not just in the evidence that had brought justice to the territory, but in the school that continued her educational mission and the community that had learned to value truth over convenience. The Double S Ranch prospered under the partnership that Mary and Silas had developed, combining his practical knowledge of cattle and land management with her organizational skills and attention to detail. Their marriage, which had begun as a desperate measure for survival, had evolved into something neither of them had expected: a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and the deep affection that grew from facing adversity together. The new wedding rings they wore were symbols of choice rather than necessity, matching bands of gold that they had selected together during a trip to the territorial capital for the trials. The ceremony where they exchanged these rings had been small and private, witnessed only by Doc and Eleanor Henderson, and conducted by Preacher Williams in the same church where their first wedding had saved Mary's life. "I want to marry you again," Silas had said one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Not because the law requires it or because circumstances demand it, but because I choose to share my life with you freely and completely." Mary had accepted his proposal with tears of joy, understanding that this second wedding would celebrate the love that had grown between them during their shared fight for justice. The woman who had entered his life as a desperate fugitive had become his partner in every sense of the word, someone who made his dreams larger and his burdens lighter. The schoolhouse bell that called children to their lessons each morning had been Sarah's idea, according to Silas, a way of announcing to the community that education was resuming its rightful place in their shared life. Mary rang that bell each day with gratitude for the opportunity to continue the work that both she and Sarah had found so meaningful, knowing that every child who learned to read was a victory against the ignorance that had allowed corruption to flourish. Doc Henderson had proven to be an excellent sheriff, bringing to law enforcement the same careful attention and genuine concern for others that had made him a beloved physician. His first official act had been to remove the gallows from the town square, declaring that justice in Dusty Creek would be measured and deliberate rather than rushed and vindictive. Law enforcement should be about protecting the innocent and helping people solve their problems, he had told Mary and Silas. The community doesn't need a sheriff who's quick to hang people. It needs someone who's quick to listen and slow to judge. Martha Colson had used the restitution money from the federal prosecution to purchase a small house in town, where she served as an unofficial advisor to other women who found themselves facing legal or financial difficulties. Her experience with the conspiracy's violence had made her a fierce advocate for victims' rights and a trusted voice in community decisions. Henry would be pleased to know that his death served a purpose beyond just enriching criminals. Martha had told Mary during one of their regular visits, "The money can't bring him back, but it can help other people avoid the suffering that we endured." The transformation of Dusty Creek, from a community willing to accept quick judgments to one that valued careful investigation and honest testimony, had been gradual but profound. People who had been prepared to watch Mary hang based on planted evidence now understood the importance of questioning authority and demanding proof before accepting accusations. Preacher Williams had found new purpose in his ministry, preaching sermons that emphasized the moral obligation to stand up for truth and protect the innocent. His church had become a center for community discussion and mutual support, a place where people could address problems collectively rather than leaving justice to corrupt officials. "Faith without works is dead," he had told his congregation during a sermon about the lessons learned from the conspiracy's exposure. "We cannot claim to love justice while remaining silent when injustice is committed in our name." The territorial government's response to the scandal had been swift and comprehensive. New laws were enacted to prevent the kind of land fraud that had victimized so many ranchers. Federal oversight was established for territorial courts, and substantial restitution was paid to the families who had lost property or loved ones to the conspiracy. Mary's testimony before the territorial legislature had been instrumental in shaping these reforms. Her teacher's ability to explain complex issues, clearly helping lawmakers understand the human cost of corruption and the importance of protecting ordinary citizens from powerful interests. Mrs. McCrae, the legislative chairman, had said after her testimony, "Your courage in exposing this conspiracy has saved countless lives and preserved the integrity of territorial law. Montana Territory is in your debt." But Mary had deflected the praise, always emphasizing that the real credit belonged to Sarah McCrae, whose 3 years of patient investigation had made justice possible. The monument erected in the Dusty Creek Cemetery honored both women, Sarah for her sacrifice and Mary for her courage in bringing that sacrifice to fruition. As the school day ended and her students filed out into the afternoon sunshine, Mary reflected on the journey that had brought her from a desperate fugitive to a respected member of the community. The blood-stained dress that had marked her arrival in Dusty Creek had been replaced by the simple, practical clothing of a frontier teacher, but the determination to seek truth and protect innocence remained unchanged. Silas arrived to walk her home, a daily ritual that they both treasured as a time to share the events of their day and plan for their future together. His cattle operation continued to prosper, but he had also become a leader in efforts to establish fair labor practices and honest business dealings throughout the territory. "How are the children today?" he asked, taking her hand as they walked through the town that had become their true home. "Eager to learn and full of questions," Mary replied, smiling at the memory of Emma's struggle with the word legacy. "They remind me every day why education matters so much. Each child who learns to read and think critically is someone who can't be easily deceived by lies or intimidated by corruption." As they reached their ranch house and saw the garden that Mary had restored to its former beauty, both of them understood that they had found something rare and precious, a love that had been forged through adversity and strengthened by shared purpose. The home that had once been Sarah's exclusive domain now belonged to both women, the past honored and the future embraced with equal reverence. The evening light painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had witnessed Mary's desperate flight from false accusations and her triumphant vindication through truth and justice. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully on land that would remain in honest hands, protected by laws that valued justice over profit and community over individual greed. As they settled on the front porch to watch the sunset, Mary and Silas understood that their story had become part of the larger narrative of the American frontier, a tale of ordinary people who refused to accept injustice and who found the courage to stand up for truth even when the cost seemed too high to bear. Their marriage had saved one life, but their partnership had helped preserve a way of life that valued honesty, hard work, and the protection of innocence. The new wedding rings they wore caught the last light of day, symbols of love that had grown from necessity into choice, from protection into partnership, from survival into the kind of deep affection that makes every challenge bearable and every victory meaningful. In a land where justice had learned to ride faster than corruption and love had proven stronger than hatred, Mary and Silas McCrae had found their place in a story that would continue long after their own chapter had ended.